I have been um, public enemy #1 in the telecoms arena every now and again. Books are interesting because I think people in their minds think of a book as something extremely credible and authoritative. If you've written the book on the subject, you must be the world's expert. Actually, it's far from the truth. You can, in fact, get a book published often more easily than a paper in a learned journal. I was essentially barred from conferences and things like that because the sponsors didn't want me there because of the message that I was telling. Basically, the phone has now outpaced what we need from it. It's a bit like a car that can suddenly go 200 miles an hour. Well, that's fantastic, but the speed limit is 70, so that's no benefit at all. And 5G is very much like that. I think there'll also be ever more emphasis on reliability because the network going down is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Society effectively stops if the telecoms network goes down. Pretty much all transport will stop, all payment systems will stop.
Hi everyone, welcome to another session for the GCS Leaders Series. Today we've got Dr. William Webb. He's an independent telecoms consultant and a leader in the telecoms industry over the past 30 years. This conversation goes through really the life cycle of technology and telecoms innovation from GSM through to all the different Gs. And comes to a point where we talk about an industry maybe that has stopped evolving and must now think about ubiquity. As someone who's been involved in this industry over many years as a recruiter, it's quite interesting to hear a kind of leader within that talk about how he sees the industry, how he's viewed the industry's growth, because that's obviously something that's affected me as well. So without further ado, here's Dr. William Webb. William, hi, how are you?
Hi, David. I'm well, thank you. Great to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you as well. I'm excited. We are just talking there that you are a 4 times doctorate. So we have William Webb with us today, and that is you're Dr. William Webb, but you're Dr. William Webb, and you've got 4 doctorates, which is pretty impressive.
Yes, one is for real. It's a PhD in mobile communications, and the other 3 are honorary doctorates, which is lovely to be awarded over the years for various things I've done in telecommunications.
Oh, brilliant, fantastic. So that's really to do with kind of, so you see that sometimes, don't you, with kind of Hollywood stars and that sort of thing when they get honor or politicians, but you're at that level, William.
But yes, I guess so. I mean, it's nice to be offered these things, but yes, I think I've had a fairly visible role in telecommunications over the years, and happily people have chosen to honor me for that, and that's great.
Again, as we said, we are the hallowed presence of Dr. William Webb. We talking about leaders in our network, and obviously telecoms and broadcast is a very key area for GCS in terms of the work we do in that industry. And we're going to talk today about you, who have had like 3 decades really of working within that telecoms, that communication space, from your kind of doctorate all the way through to kind of working with, Ofcom, IET, and now you're working as an independent telecoms advisor, really,
Yes.
to different industry figures. So as we always do within the Leaders Series, give us a taste, give us a flavour, William, of how you got into the industry and why you've stuck with it, really, because obviously you've been on it on a very long journey.
It has been a very long journey. Why did I get into it? It was one of those happy accidents in a way. I was at university, and the course I enjoyed the most, I was doing a general electronic engineering degree, was the one on communications. And I think that's partly because the lecturer was just so much more vibrant and interesting than many of the others. And I sort of went up to him afterwards and said, I'm really enjoying your courses. And he said, well, I've got my own little consultancy company, come work for me and do a PhD. And it all seemed such an obvious thing to do that I just followed on into that. So it wasn't really a conscious decision that telecoms was going to be a really important topic area of such. It was more just one of those fortuitous, I like this guy, this looks like a good opportunity, let's go for it. And then, as you said, I stuck with telecoms for over 3 decades. And that's because it's been a phenomenal ride. So those of us who are in our 50s or older will remember back the starting era, the first mobiles that appeared, the advent of 2G or GSM, that huge growth in the number of people using phones, and then of course over the years we've gone from voice to smartphones to all the things that we do today. So it's been a fantastic journey to be on. Although actually, interestingly, that's slowed down a lot in the last few years, and we'll probably come back and talk more about that. We sort of have reached a sort of a bit of a plateau in telecommunications now. And I suspect if I had another 3 decades ahead of me, I might think now is the time to start changing out of telecommunications. But I think I'll be optimistic to assume that much more. So I figure I'll probably stick with it for the what does remain of my career.
Yeah, probably. I think, yeah, we would. Well, you never know.
You never know.
You can always teach an old dog new tricks, can't
Yeah.
you, William? You know, it's um, and I think, it's interesting for me as well, because as a recruiter, and I was a proper recruitment consultant once. Obviously, I run a recruitment business now, but as I think I mentioned to you when we talk about this chat, my key market and my key kind of area of work was embedded software engineers.
Yeah.
And I'm very much working with companies such as Samsung, such as Nokia, Lucent, etc., within those telecoms networks, just when GSM, 2G, 3G
Yeah.
was coming in there. So yeah, I guess, you can see that within if you started, you went to university 86, and I
Correct.
guess
Yeah.
it started within the commercial world in like early 90s.
That's right. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So you've seen such a huge revolution in the world of telecoms,
Absolutely.
and such rapid changes. So, and I've seen it too, and there's been so much investment into it, and also as a user, the thing I love about working within the engineering world is that I'm not an engineer, but I can supply people into the projects, and then I can kind of see at the end the things they make.
Yes.
So I've finally got a 3G phone handset in my hand, and I'm like, oh, okay, some contracts working on that. So
Yeah.
it's quite interesting. How do you, what are the challenges, talking in a kind of more universal way, what are the challenges of working in an industry as a leader, driving protocols, driving, big organizations? What are the challenges of working in a rapidly evolving sector that where it's difficult to control pace? And I think, if we think about now, you can kind of see that with AI as well, can't you? The rapid evolution of AI is similar to the rapid evolution of telecoms at certain points.
Yeah. So actually, I think a lot of if I look back, a lot of the challenges I've had have actually been not so much with the technology and those who are going to adopt it, but those who are displaced by it to some degree. So actually, for example, for mobile communications, there's been a need for ever more radio spectrum as the number of users and their demands has grown. And we've seen that in all these auctions, the 3G auctions and the 4G auctions. But each time you auction spectrum, you effectively have to move somebody out of it in order to free it up to be used. And it's those people who are being disadvantaged effectively that are often the biggest challenge of all. I remember back to one point where one of the changes I wanted to make when I was at Ofcom, the UK telecoms regulator, would actually reduce to some degree the amount of radio spectrum that wireless microphones can use. And you might think, well, hey, why is that a big deal? We're all used to wireless microphones, but that's kind of fine. But then it turned out that quite a big use of wireless microphones are stage shows, like those in the West End, where you might have 20 or 30 performers all using wireless microphones. And in fact, he got to the point where Andrew Lloyd Webber was making complaints in the House of Lords, specifically naming me as a problem for the country because of my potential plans which would disrupt the wireless microphone community, which eventually did get through. But actually, that's often the bigger problem than convincing people that a new phone is going to be beneficial to them. Most people are quite keen to adopt that, or even to push through new technology, because by and large, most of the companies, the operators and the manufacturers, are keen to have new technology because it nearly always allows them to do things better or less expensively. So that's often not the challenge. It's often those legacy users and dealing with them that can be the difficulty, and continues to be the difficulty in many different areas.
And I guess that's, you see that as we said, to kind of bring it, I guess this is happening in the late 90s, the noughties, the tens, but you can see that with AI in in some ways, a bigger scale, because the displacement of X is really about people, isn't it? That's what you hear.
Exactly. And so I think a lot of the the concerns now are around how's this going to affect me detrimentally. People, I think, can see that AI can be beneficial. It can help them do all sorts of things, but that doesn't offset the worries that it might take away their jobs or otherwise affect their livelihoods. And so it is often that change process that's problematic. And I think risk aversion is a natural attribute, particularly of governments and of regulators and things like that. So all those entities are typically going to kind of say, hang on a minute, let's just take this slowly and carefully. So that's where the problems tend to lie. And in some cases, they're well-founded.
And how do you deal with that then? Displacement being a huge thing, and people get very passionate about it. In your experience, and I'm assuming because there's been such rapid technological advances along the way that you've had to deal with this a lot. What are your kind of key tips for dealing with this for leaders when they're driving new technological innovations into their businesses or into their community?
Yeah. So what I've learned to my cost initially was that you absolutely need to speak to all the stakeholders. You need to talk to them, to listen to them, to understand their point of view, to try and explain to them how they're going to be affected and potentially how they might be compensated. And even if you can't fully appease them, the fact that you've talked to them, the fact that you've understood what they might say means that, first of all, their attacks back at you tend to be a little less vigorous. And secondly, you're prepared. You know what's coming, so you can effectively work out strategies. You can brief your CEOs or whoever that this is likely to happen. So go talk to everyone, even those won't like to hear your message. And ideally do it face to face, because that human element really helps, particularly if you've got some kind of bad news or you're being somewhat antagonistic. It helps to be there in person and take the time to do that. And that's something that I have learned over the years is really critical in this change process.
And you strike me as quite a calm person, William. It strikes me as someone that if someone's kind of mouthing off at you, you can hold your nerve. Is that a kind of a have I read you right there? Because it
Yeah,
sounds to me like if I was like, oh, this is unfair what you're doing to me, you would
yeah.
pay straight back to use
I
cricket
think that's
parlance.
right, and that's not because I've trained myself in some wondrous manner. I think that's just my natural sort of personality type. Effectively, is that I'm not one that tends to suddenly erupt in anger or get particularly emotional. I'm much more of a sort of logical, introverted type of character who will think, yeah, okay, why is he saying that? What's going on here? What's the right approach? And so I rarely will lose it. I mean, once or twice I think I have done, but normally I can stay pretty calm, and that clearly helps a lot if you can kind of be calm and not react. But as I said, that's something I think I'm just fortunate that it's my personality type.
Yeah, and you've had a very, very successful career. You've risen to the top of a very, very large kind of growth industry. Um, but you started, like I just said, like as a software engineer,
Yeah.
right? You kind of start from an engineering background, the types of people I would place. What do you know, was that something that drove you? Like you wanted to do it? You wanted to kind of get into that management or leadership kind of level? Or is it something that kind of not fell in your lap, but like people felt that you would be good for it?
So I don't think I ever had an aspiration to simply be a manager for the sake of being a manager. I didn't think to myself, gosh, I'll have succeeded when I've got 1,000 people working for me or anything like that. There was never any of those particular targets. I was always much more interested in the problems and the potential future and how that might unfold. What could devices do for us? Where might telecommunications go? How could we provide this sort of coverage? But what I discovered is that if I wanted to be able to deliver that, I certainly wasn't going to do it simply sat in a back room writing software code. That happened after somebody else had already said, here's where we're going to go. So I needed to get involved in strategy. So actually early on, it became so clearer and clearer to me that I needed to have a pretty good understanding of strategy. So not long after I finished my PhD, I actually went and did an MBA to get a bit of a theoretical background on the strategic side. And then I tended to try and find roles that were a sort of mix of strategy and technology, so I could actually work at that kind of level. And that's broadly where I've sat. I've never made it to CEO of any significant company. I've normally been a CTO type character or similar. where I may have some people reporting to me, not necessarily a large team, but my role is predominantly to kind of be there at board level to provide strategic input based on technological viewpoints. And that, I think, has fitted my characteristics well, but it's also meant I've been able to have a fairly good influence as long as I'm sat in the right places, of course.
And how has your leadership style evolved as you've moved into different areas and also different types of organizations? So you've worked in consultancy, you've worked in, well, I guess, membership bodies, watchdogs, that sort of thing. I mean, has it generally been the same, or have you had to kind of change your management style for, or leadership style for different types of roles?
I think it's evolved steadily. I can't think of any point where I had a sudden dramatic change in style. What I found works for me and seems to have worked well in my career is actually the best thing to do is to be honest, open, consistent, um, to put forward your viewpoint, but to admit your mistakes, and never to be too much in the pay of others. So even when I've worked for companies, I've been willing to be at a conference, or whatever, and say effectively, actually, I think this is where, this is where my company might not be necessarily going out in the right direction. So not to just be a corporate mouthpiece. Now, of course, that has its own difficulties because you can upset the company you're with. But I think over time I've gained a lot of respect that people believe that actually I say what I think is true rather than what I'm being paid to say is true, or because I've got some other agenda at hand. And I think that's really helped people sort of respect what I have to say. And happily, for the most part, what I've said has been proven correct, and that buys you credibility as a track record. And I think the mix of those two means that people then are willing to listen to you as a leader because you've shown you've got things right in the past and you appear to be an honest, credible, unbiased individual that's giving helpful advice. So that's where I've tried to get to. It's had its difficulties over time. There's been moments where I've said stuff that effectively has probably knocked me out of the industry for a couple of years because people have thought it's been so antagonistic to a number of companies that they've actually said, bar William from coming to these conferences and things like that. So it can have its downsides as well, but I think over time it's worked for me.
And you've been quite, we kind of come on to it, but you've been quite vocal, haven't you, in your opinion of the telecoms industry?
Yeah.
You've written quite a lot of, obviously blogs, pieces, I believe even books on this, Is that something, again, that you feel with your type of career, as the type of leader that you are, which is very much a kind of a leader in thought and innovation, is something you feel is important? Not all leaders do it. Not all leaders give themselves the time to do it.
No, absolutely. So I think for the way I work, at least, if I want to lead, it's because I set out viewpoints that I'm trying to get the industry as a whole to coalesce around. And the only way to set out a viewpoint that's going to be widely heard is going to be in some form of written word, typically. Podcasts are great, and I'm delighted to be here, but it probably doesn't have quite the reach that a really well written article or book might do. So actually, fairly early on, I started concentrating on books. You're right. In fact, I've just this week published my 22nd book.
Wow.
And books are interesting because I think people in their minds think of a book as something extremely credible and authoritative. If you've written the book on the subject, you must be the world's expert. Actually, it's far from the truth. You can, in fact, get a book published often more easily than a paper in a learned journal. So books actually are not necessarily perfection, but they do, I think, buy you a certain amount of kudos and credibility and give you space to set out viewpoints. And so there's been a few of those books have particularly struck chords. I think back in 2000, I wrote one called the future of mobile communications that predicted where things were going 20 years out, which actually took us to 2020. So of course we can now look back and see how that went. And in fact, it went amazingly well, actually, to blow my own trumpet. My predictions for 20 years hence from 2000 were pretty much spot on in almost every respect.
So just to stop you there then, so just give us so if you wrote this in 2000.
Yeah.
Right. So that's when we were walking around with Nokia
Correct.
3110.
Exactly right.
And so if you were to give me a kind of a flavor of what you predicted in the year 2000 that would come to pass by 2020, just give me
Yeah,
an anecdote of what you got right.
yeah. So as what you said, the phone we had then had a tiny little black and white screen. Its keypad was numeric only. You used it for voice. You might send a text message, but it was a real pain because you had to push the A key 3 times to get to letter C and so on. All this kind of stuff. And that was about it. You wouldn't try web surfing or anything. So, for example, I predicted that by 2020, we'd be able to use our phone to board a plane. When we got off the plane, it would tell us where the nearest Starbucks was. It would pre-order our drink, and we could pay for it using our phone. Now, that's all perfectly normal these days, but actually, back in 2020, that was an astonishing leap of faith from the phone that we had there that had none of those capabilities.
And do you, I mean, and it did come true. And I think both you and I, and if there's any younger people listening to this, like I love to speak to my children about how rubbish technology was in the old days, you know, and they're like, really? Oh God, I can't believe it. How did you do anything? How did you meet up with people? How did you know where people was? I don't really, I can't even remember how I used to do it, you know. Obviously the phone in our hand is so powerful. You and I, who started our careers at a certain point, just can't really believe where it's come to. Can we,
Absolutely.
really? Except you two, because you obviously predicted it.
Yeah.
Was there any predictions that you made that haven't yet happened that you still
There's a
believe could
couple
happen?
that, I mean, they've happened, but nothing like I thought they would. So, robotic vacuum cleaners, for example, I assumed by now would be everywhere, you know, that you wouldn't do your own vacuuming. I think it's about 3 or 4% of households have a robotic vacuum cleaner. So it's not that they didn't happen, but they absolutely didn't make it to the scale and to its.
Yeah, because they're still working on networks, I guess, and understanding where they are and GPS systems and that sort of thing, aren't they?
And
So,
also they just tend to be a bit rubbish, unless you've got hard flooring and ideally open plan one level of apartment, then all the standard little things like doors and staircases will trip them up. The other thing that
and when you're talking about displacement, I guess like they would displace cleaners, right? So you have to think about displacement for cleaners. So yeah.
the other thing I
Yeah.
overpredicted was the ability of your phone to work out and pre-plan your day for you. So I kind of said, oh, you know, first thing in the morning before I wake up, my phone can look at my calendar. It can work out where I need to be in London, let's say. It can check the trains are running on time. It can look at the weather. It can kind of work everything out. It can then work out when to wake me up based on the fact that I'm going to need 10 minutes longer because there's a delay on the way to the station or something. And then my alarm clock will go off at the right time. And that hasn't really happened because it turns out to be an astonishingly difficult task unless you annotate your calendar to the nth degree that none of us are really prepared to do, for the phone to kind of work all that out just from some cryptic calendar entries.
Well, I guess Copilot and the AI systems now are saying that they can do that, and that's starting. So yeah, you hadn't. I guess you hadn't had the time. You were factoring so much. You hadn't had the time to factor in large language models and artificial intelligence. But yeah, maybe if you'd waited 10 years, you might be able to factor that one in as well. And I guess that links into kind of power of chips. I guess that links into power of technology, because obviously what you're very much focused on is the power of the network and the data you can get over the network. But now, I guess what you can now factor in is the power of these, you know, semiconductors and the devices that are being that are taking the network.
Yes, yeah, and indeed, things like Moore's law have been around, of course, forever, and have given a fairly good indication of the trend lines of the sort of power that you might get out of semiconductor devices and similar. So it's been possible for quite some time to at least understand that side of things. Although, you know, there are times where more processing doesn't actually necessarily help you very much, unless it's a particular style of processing.
Yeah. So getting back into kind of you working within, you know, a lot of your, you know, those predictions, therefore, you'd probably be saying these are happening in 2015.
Yeah.
But that's the start of a very long journey, right? So how do you balance that kind of, we can do this in 2015, which basically no one is very excited about at all, versus we can get this done in 2001? How do you get that excitement about things, about short-term priorities, versus one day we'll be able to book ourselves onto a plane?
Yeah. So I think there's two ways to do that. With an established company, I think you have to break it down into small steps. So you can sort of say, here's the end vision, but by the way, if you could just implement Bluetooth in your phone, that would be a fantastic first step. And in doing that, you'll sell more phones because people will start to use it for X, Y, and Z. And you don't need to worry too much about the fact that 5 steps further down the road, your phone is now paired with your car and is effectively using Google Maps to give your car directions. That's, don't worry about that. Just think of these as smaller steps. If you can break it down, then that really helps. The other option is completely opposite direction, which I did at one point, which is a startup. Startups tend to love a vision of something that's going to happen 5 or 10 years out. But if it's too close, of course, they're more likely to be able to get to it before a bigger company. So it needs to be far enough out that they can ramp and be the first there and start to deploy. The challenge there is often startups are too early, and that was certainly the startup that I was most deeply involved in, which related to an Internet of Things product. Started in 2011. It was sold to Huawei, as it happens, in 2014. And the actual technology that was developed was only really used in about 2020. So actually, it was probably 3 or 4 years too early even then. But because you never quite know, startups are often good vehicles to get that initial work done and then be picked up by a bigger company.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of take the technology, as it were, and then use it in their other products, that sort of thing. And that's an interesting thing then. So when you think about these kind of startup elements, I guess when you're advising people in your role at the moment, there's a kind of almost like a Goldilocks point where it's like you've got to hit it not too far ahead, but not
Exactly.
not too sweet, but not too sour.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly right.
From your side, as you kind of move forward now, you know, what I think is really, really interesting from the conversations we've had is, even in this conversation thus far, we've been talking about the fast pace of innovation. And within telecoms now, I think you have a stance, don't you, that you feel that fast pace of innovation is almost, it's come to a point where we shouldn't be innovating now, or we could be innovating, but it's not, you're not going to get the same pickup because you feel, for instance, 5G is almost unnecessary. I think
Correct.
that's
Yeah.
right in saying.
So interestingly, if we go back to my sort of predictions of the future, um, I predicted huge change between 2000 and 2020. But then when asked, okay, so what comes after that, I was scratching my head a bit because I couldn't think of anything that we needed. It wasn't a case of the technology just couldn't deliver more. It was a case of, well, actually, if we can do all that, what more do we want apart from teleportation and other things that are just not possible anyway? And that, I think, has been what's transpired, actually. So if we think back to this period of change, we did change what we did with our mobile phone dramatically up until really about 2020. But since then, I suspect for most people, the phone has looked the same, has done the same thing. They haven't really materially changed what they use it for during that time. Maybe a bit more data is being used on it. And the only point of interest is the camera only better than the previous one. And that's because basically the phone has now outpaced what we need from it. It's a bit like a car that can suddenly go 200 miles an hour. Well, that's fantastic, but the speed limit is 70, so that's no benefit at all. And 5G is very much like that. It's taken us to speeds and capabilities that are far in excess of anything we actually need. And therefore the benefit is not obvious because we could get exactly the same performance from a 4G phone as far as we're concerned. And the same is true for home networks as well. Now, if you have fiber, certainly if you have fiber to your home, but even if you have fiber to a cabinet close by your home, then you have all the speed that you're going to need in the home, and improving it won't improve anything there.
And they talk a lot about in telecoms world about efficiencies and productivity for the wider range, rural areas, that sort of
Yeah,
stuff. I guess your argument was, don't spend all the money on trying to get 5G everywhere, like,
exactly.
which we know doesn't happen. Spend all the money on trying to get 3G everywhere because that's good enough.
Exactly right. So essentially the focus should now shift from faster, better. So essentially everything from 1G, the old analog phones, right through to 5G was always about faster. And in fact, roughly 10 times faster. If you look at each generation, it was 10 times faster than the previous one. That was always the focus. But now that's just not relevant. We don't need to go faster, but we do need to solve the remainder of the coverage issues. There's plenty of places in the country where coverage is poor, both from a mobile point of view and from a broadband point of view. Those aren't really technological fixes, or at least you take a somewhat different direction. As you said, use an older technology and find ways to deploy it more cheaply so that you can overcome the economics. And that's sort of the remaining problems that we've got. And in fact, there are other solutions as well to that. So I mentioned that I just published a book this week. It's on, in fact, the use of satellites and what's called direct-to-device communication. So a satellite that talks directly to your handheld phone.
Is this things like Starlink or something like
Correct.
that?
Yeah.
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 As a way to provide coverage in deeply rural areas, and the coverage it provides is relatively poor, but it does mean that you can certainly send messages. You might be able to have a voice call, and if you're out of coverage and you've car's broken down, then that is
That's
a
what you need.
godsend. So all you want,
Yeah.
basically.
And I know that like in a lot of kind of rural areas, a lot of kind of, you know, third world areas, a lot of war areas, that's what they're using, isn't it?
Yeah.
Starlink is the one.
Exactly. So to sort of come back to leadership styles, as this became apparent to me, I thought in the end, it's time to set my views out on this. And I initially thought, well, I'll write a short paper, and then I thought, well, actually, the only thing that will have real impact is a book. So I put together a book. I called it "The End of Telecoms History," which was
Wow.
a bit of a riff on, of course, the end of history, and it basically set out with a lot of background data the view that we just expressed, that we have more than enough, and it showed with a whole load of charts and so on, plenty of evidence that was the case. And that book was very widely read, actually, for a telecoms book. I mean, certainly it wasn't a bestseller in the Jeffrey Archer
Right.
category, but it was. I think most people who are doing anything strategic in the telecoms industry would have either read it or know about its tenor. And they may or may not agree, but it clearly helps set out a position that then forces people to start thinking about things. I remember meeting someone in Qualcomm, a very significant US company that makes chipsets and similar for mobile phones, and they told me that all of their senior leadership team had been required to read it and then report back their views on it. So that kind of level of input, and that, I think, is what a book can do, particularly one that's just happens to hit the right point in time.
But I think going back to your point about displacement and technologies overtaking, and I guess this is a displacement point, right? So I'm assuming that your book, particularly saying let's not innovate anymore, didn't necessarily go down like a well within the community of telecoms innovators, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I'm sure you weren't. You were maybe even public enemy number one.
Yes. So you can imagine companies, particularly like, let's say, Ericsson and Nokia, who sell network equipment to the mobile operators, would like the mobile operators to be constantly demanding more, better, newer kit, because then that means they can sell more of it. So they would like to have a different kind of narrative around that. And yes, I have been public enemy number one in the telecoms arena every now and again. Way back in the final book, perhaps to mention, back in 2016, I published a book called The 5G Myth. So in 2016, 5G was about 3 years away. It appeared about 2019. But back in 2016, essentially, I could see that it was on a path that, to my mind, was not a very sensible one. Certainly not one that would result in increased revenue for the operators or a healthier industry, or indeed any material benefits for the end users. So I said,
And this is because they've spent a huge amount of money on 5G networks, telling us this is wonderful. And really, one, they can't roll it out everywhere. And secondly, it's not that much better than 4G.
and they gain nothing as a result. So our monthly bills have not gone up because nobody is willing to pay more for 5G. In fact, if anything, they've gone down slightly. So it's not the case that they spent all this money on a new technology and then been able to reap the rewards of it through higher income,
as they had done in previous kind of iterations of the G, as it were.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
so essentially that message did not go down well at all with pretty much anybody, actually, in the industry, because so many people stood to benefit from 5G, from academics who would get funding to research it, to operators, to manufacturers. And for a few years, as I mentioned, I was essentially barred from conferences and things like that because the sponsors didn't want me there because of the message that I was telling. It's now come to be seen that actually that was entirely correct. And of course that now helps with my credibility, but it does mean that you might have to suffer periods of being in the wildernesses, so to speak, for a few years.
So I mean, I think was the other thing I was just quick questions are going to ask about, and going back to your 2000 thing, is for me as a user, right? What's interesting is thinking about me as a user, you know, back in the old days, you get a new phone, you keep upgrading your phone, keep upgrading your phone because it's going to give you new
Yeah.
stuff, right? What you're saying basically is if I upgrade my phone now from an X
Yeah.
to a whatever R, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah, it would give me a better
Yeah.
camera. And I can't
Predominantly,
really be
not
bothered
much
with that.
else. Yeah.
And then sometimes Samsungs fold on themselves
Yeah.
or something like that. But I'm an iPhone guy, so I just basically
Yeah.
stick with my thing. Whereas in the past, it'd be like, wow, it can do that.
Yeah.
That's amazing,
Yeah.
you know? And I think the other thing is when you were talking about 2000, because for me as a user, I'd much prefer to be on Wi-Fi than 5G. So did you kind of predict that there'd be this, like, what actually you don't factor in is that there's going to be so much Wi-Fi around that people won't even need to bother with this 5G thing, or there's this kind of base level Wi-Fi system that is actually much more like, if you can get onto it, that's a much better thing to use.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Ready.
So back in 2000, Wi-Fi existed, but it was far from widespread. It wasn't the sort of thing where you could just walk into a coffee shop and assume that you'd find a Wi-Fi network to connect to. You might not even have one in your home. Back in those days, you might still be plugging into the socket on the wall. But it certainly was clear to me that had the potential to be a really valuable use of way to transfer data. And it just seemed intuitively obvious that people would spend a lot more time transferring information when they were indoors than outdoors, because the by far the largest amount of information that you send is video. And if you're going to watch a video, by and large, you would prefer to be sat down somewhere generally, and that generally means indoors. So most of your video watching is going to be indoors. That can be served on Wi-Fi, and therefore, actually, the vast majority of your traffic can flow over Wi-Fi. So
Right. Yeah.
that was always pretty clear. The mobile operators didn't like that story because they would much rather that all your traffic flowed across their networks. But it's come to pass that, in fact, people prefer Wi-Fi. Phones automatically prefer Wi-Fi. So once they've moved into your home, they'll automatically log onto your Wi-Fi, and then they'll use that out of preference the whole time they're there.
And it's sad, really, because obviously telecoms has driven quite a lot of innovation, and now that's. I think you've described it as a utility. We need it,
Yeah,
but we don't get that excited about electricity. We don't get that excited about water. Obviously, if we haven't got it, then we we worry. But that's how you see it now, right? Telecoms is like 3G, 4G.
yeah.
You need it, but you don't get excited about it.
Correct. So if you think about when you come to look at changing your tariff or whatever, you don't sort of go and look at what high tech features is Vodafone going to give me versus EE. Can I get some
Price.
super duper head up display version of this or whatever, like when you buy a car or something. Instead, you just say, well, I want 20 gigs a month, which is the cheapest place to get it from. So you're assuming that it's exactly the same 20 gigabytes wherever you go, and it's just a basic commodity that you're buying into. And beyond that, you might have a slight interest in the special offers that they provide, but that's nothing to do with telecoms. So essentially, we've got to the point now where we see it as a utility. We don't see it as a differentiated thing. We don't particularly look for someone that's trying to provide something different. And no, that's not a bad thing. It's not so that was a wrong direction or anything. I think it's just a natural outcome, actually. In some ways, I argue we should celebrate that actually, through innovation and through investment, we've reached the point where telecoms has become so widespread and so able to deliver what we want that we don't need to think about a better version of it. It's just a utility.
Yeah, I still feel it's quite sad because obviously, like you said, like it's been such a successful
Yeah.
innovation over the years. And then when you kind of come back to talk to people now, because you mentioned your public enemy number one for a few years, I assume now that the world has caught up with you now and people have kind of forgiven you and now they're talking to you
Yeah.
again, as they should. And I guess first thing is, how does that feel? As a human being, you've said something and everyone's like, this is terrible. Why have you done this? How does that feel to you?
I mean, there's a natural human reaction to want to sort of crow a bit and say, "Told you so." But I do my very best to resist that because I know that from the other side, there's nothing more annoying than somebody popping up and saying, "Aha, I was right and you were wrong."
Yeah.
So I tend to try and blow my trumpet in much more subtle ways of just occasionally when I would write something kind of saying, brackets as predicted in the 5G myth or something like that, just to kind of make that point. But I don't try and kind of keep pushing that point too hard. I think people generally know of it anyway, and it wouldn't do me any favors to annoy others by bragging, essentially.
And we're going back to displacement now. So what do you feel is the future now for the telecoms industry? Is it one of consolidation? Is it where there's pricing, or will there continue to be innovations, do you think?
I think it will be one of hunkering down as utilities. So if you look at how a utility tends to behave, by and large, it tries to reduce its costs as much as possible, because it can't really push up consumer prices generally, unless something completely untoward happens, like a war in Ukraine and oil shocks. And so the key thing is managing that cost base going forwards, while still delivering great consumer service. And of course, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have innovation. You can have wonderful innovations in networks. That means you might reduce the number of maintenance engineers you need or whatever. The public don't see that as such, but it reduces the overall cost base. So that's kind of where I expect things to go. And we tend to see as well with utilities that there are far fewer of them. We don't have 3 different water pipes to our home or 3 different electricity pipes. We just have the one. So you might imagine telecoms would naturally, gradually consolidate down to fewer and fewer networks. In the UK, we've just seen Vodafone and Three merge. I think that's, we'll see a steady progression of that globally and nationally over time as we hunker down to fewer and fewer. But I think there'll also be ever more emphasis on reliability, because the network going down is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Society effectively stops if the telecoms network goes down. Pretty much all transport will stop, all payment systems will stop. Almost everything that we rely on to do anything in our world comes to a halt if the telecom systems goes down. So a focus on that kind of thing. So a different kind of focus. And as you rightly said, probably fewer people. We've seen Ericsson and Nokia and others reducing their headcount 10% year on year for the last few years. I think that will carry on for a few more years, perhaps. So, sadly, not a growth industry, not one that's necessarily going to be sucking in lots of new engineers. But for those who are in the right place at the right time, still a really beneficial, interesting place to be.
An essential industry, I guess. Thinking about, like, as you do, kind of futurist. It's interesting, actually. I went to a future workplace conference the other week, and I saw Google Beam.
Yeah.
Which I've signed it. I was just checking. I've signed an NDA about it, but I think I can talk about it.
Okay.
I don't know if you've heard of
I
Google Beam.
Heard of Google Beam. What is it?
So Google Beam was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. Google Beam is a video conferencing tool where it uses certain, it plays with your eyes in terms of the context, the way it presents the image to you.
Yeah.
But the clever thing it does is it makes it look as if the image is there with you. So you're taught, it's like, it's a bit like, I reckon most people this would know it looks a little bit like R2-D2 at the start of Star Wars, right? Or not, the British layer on top of R2-D2 at the start of Star Wars. And it was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. And that to me was like, that surely is, the future of telecoms, like how to present that in a kind of a way that the actual image is not, there's a physical image, I'm just making things up here, William, but I guess it's
no, there's certainly plenty of stuff there. And of course, we've been through various iterations of attempts to do similar kinds of things. The first clunky one that failed was virtual reality and the whole metaverse concept. We've now got smart glasses which attempt to project things onto the glasses. Those are so. But yes, something that effectively can project straight onto to your retina or similar and give you the impression of holographic information in front of you would be fantastic.
And I guess then what would have to happen then is they would have to push up the amount of data, because this would be, I want to be able to see someone anywhere. I want to be walking along with William. I want to be doing my podcast with William sat on the top of the pyramid or something like that, and that's what I want. That's
so to some degree that's true, although it's all still video information, although maybe the resolution goes up. And my thesis is actually often it will be displacement video. So instead of watching some YouTube video, you'll now be doing something in the pyramids.
doing
But
in the
essentially,
video.
you're substituting one form of video for another by and large. Not I mean, there will be exceptions, but actually, the incremental growth for traffic might not be that great, but the user experience could well be a huge improvement. Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess the other innovation that you could have in telecoms, obviously we're recording this now where there's just been the SpaceX IPO,
Yeah,
making Elon Musk richest man ever,
indeed.
etc. But the whole idea, I believe, of that IPO is to give the money so that we can one day build cities on other
Yes.
planets, right? We're really talking futurists now. So would it be right to assume that, telecoms, to kind of create, like, so I can call Mars, that's a whole new innovation that, like, telecoms couldn't work out yet,
Yeah,
or can it? I don't know. Is that a kind of thing?
to some degree it can, because actually, the laws of physics are just the same everywhere. So you could drop a 4G base station on the moon or on Mars, and it would work pretty much fine as long as it had electricity. There wouldn't be a material change. There is actually some study going on now about telecoms on the moon, on the assumption there might be a moon base at some point, and it might be sensible to have a telecoms network there and effectively be able to beam that back to the Earth. The technology is there. It's more a case actually of harmonizing it
Logistics or
so that we
something, I
don't
guess.
have different countries all interfering with each other, trying to do different things and trying to work out kind of the overall jurisdictional issues around that,
Yeah.
which is more
As we've done on planet Earth. So once we've
exactly
all kind of
right.
got together and made the same
Yeah,
decisions
no,
as we don't usually do we? So yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
So it is. So you're quite right that it's a new area for telecoms, and yeah, one that's definitely got its own interesting challenges.
Well, I guess I speak from a point of, as a recruiter, you're always looking for high growth in innovative industries, because that's where demand lies, right? So I'm always thinking about what's the next pivot, where are the areas of the industry, and that's what you have to do as a leader, I guess. And so I guess I kind of, come back to our conversation. What are you looking at now when you kind of, obviously, an industry being utilities doesn't make it a bad industry, it just makes it an essential industry, really. Okay, utility is an essential. So what excites you about the future? What are you looking at? What are you talking to your clients about?
Yeah. So for me, the final element, which we talked about a bit, is actually what I call ubiquity. I would like us to have a world where there was just nowhere where we were unconnected. The remotest place, the basement, whatever it might be, the train, the airplane, everywhere you went, you were connected, and connected well, such that you could do whatever you wanted to do. And so it's driving down that road that interests me. And there's a couple of areas where I've been doing a bit of work and thinking, which are helping in that way. One, I think, is the way to get there is actually to stitch together multiple networks. So we talked a bit about Wi-Fi. Essentially, if you could really have seamless integration between all of the Wi-Fi nodes out there in the world, because at the moment you can only access a limited number of them, and all the mobile networks and the satellite networks and any other kind of resource that you might be able to get hold of, and stitch that together into one overall seamless network, that would dramatically improve the coverage that you had. And then the second is the idea of satellites providing the infill for the more rural areas and bringing all those elements together. So that's where I'm spending probably most of my strategic thinking time at the moment, moving down that particular road. It's a tough part because the problem is who pays for it, and who gets excited about it. The mobile operators, not so much, because they don't think they'll make much more money if this sort of thing exists. But perhaps entities like SpaceX might be vehicles that might push in that direction, but they don't have all of the levers. Entities like Google could, in principle, stitch it all together, but they worry about upsetting some of their customer groups, like the mobile operators, in doing so. Governments potentially could help, but they tend to be too slow. So it's trying to find the vehicles that can actually drive down that road to something that's more of a social good than an economic good. That's the real challenge there.
So that basically I could get. So I live in West Berkshire.
Yeah,
Okay, I go to Mortimer Station. I know you're living. I think you're in
Cambridgeshire.
Cambridge, aren't you?
Yeah,
I go to Mortimer Station, which is a lovely leafy Berkshire. Go there. I know for a fact in the half mile roundabout round that, because it's in a kind of dip by a hill, nothing. I can't make a phone call. I can't browse the net. There's no Wi-Fi, nothing. And I will lose any call as I go in that little dip. So that's ubiquity, right?
Yep,
There is
correct.
no, I can make a call from Mortimer Station, which is the ultimate aim.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly right. And there was a spell a few months ago where I think a very substantial number of letters to MPs were to do with paying for car parking using an app where there was no coverage. So people parked their car, they found they couldn't pay, so they would just go off. They come back and find that they had a parking ticket, and then complain, "Well, how could I possibly have paid because there was no coverage?" And
There's no coverage there. So you
it
want me to
sounds
pay.
trivial, but it's an annoyance, and fixing that would help in its own way.
Brilliant. Well, I wish you well for that, William.
Thank you.
And I think it's been, for me, to hear about someone that's tracked the whole life cycle, not the whole life cycle, but a big part of the life cycle of an industry from innovator through to near ubiquity is really, really interesting. And I think the way you're dealing with it is a credit to you. And talking about kind of ways forward is really, really interesting. So yeah, keep doing it, William. Keep kind of pushing yourself out there.
Absolutely, I will. Thank you, David.
Brilliant. Have a great day. Thank you.